Missing it?
The pins I just went and got.
Really? All right. Should we get going? Good evening, everyone. Where I grew up, which is in Southern Africa, we say Masquera say, meaning good afternoon, how was your day? My name is Richard Mtisi. I'm Associate Professor of History and Identity Studies at Luther. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's engagement with Father Michael Lapsley. Following a short video about Father Lapsley's life story, Professor of Religion, Dr. Nave, we engaged Father Michael Lapsley in further conversation about forgiveness and the importance of knowledge and acknowledging in journeys of healing. There will also be some time for open Q&A with Father Michael Lapsley and Professor Nave. We aim to keep the conversation productive and civil in the spirit of learning and challenging ourselves. We also like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that there is much work to do beyond the acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which this college stands was home to the Iowa, the Sek, the Fox, the Dakota, the Winnebago, and Ho-Chunk people whose relationship to this land continues today. We acknowledge that the Ho-Chunk people moved here from Wisconsin against their will. In the latest generation, pressure from the US government and the immigrant settlers, such as those who founded and attended this college, forced them to relocate again. We acknowledge that this land, once called neutral ground, was created by the US government to control the movement, the lives, and livelihood of Native people. We acknowledge that the history of this college is directly tied to the dispossession of the Sek, the Fox, the Dakota, and the forced migration of the Ho-Chunk people. Father Michael Lapsley's visit is supported by the Luther College Religion Department's Owen Fellowship. The Owen Fellowship, established in 1992 through a gift by Odin and Carol Owen, enables the religion department to invite distinguished guest lecturers to Luther College to explore and discuss interactions between religion and science, religion and politics, or religion and the arts. Owen Fellows usually spend 3 to 5 days on campus, meeting with both faculty and students to discuss issues in formal and informal settings. Father Lapsley arrived in Decorah on Tuesday evening and will depart tomorrow in the afternoon. In addition to tonight's presentation, Father Lapsley's itinerary includes 4 Luther College class visits, a public brown bag lunch conversation that was, that took place yesterday. That happened between Father Michael Lapsley and Marita Kandakuzo, who is the author, broadcaster, and founder of the UK-based nonprofit, The Forgiveness Project. He also took part in a meeting with the Student Senate leadership, exploring servant leadership. There was also a private luncheon with faculty and staff, sort of nominated students, and a meet and greet session with community members and leaders. Father Michael Lapsley will conclude his visit tomorrow by speaking in chapel in the CFL at 10:30, and then engaging one last class. I think it's Professor Scott Haley's class. For events like this, we like to have a current student introduce the speaker. Tonight, that awesome responsibility falls upon Avihe Kalipondoka, a fellow Southern African, and one of the students, Professor Guy, and I took to South Africa this past term. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Avihe, who will introduce our special guest.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Good evening.
As Professor said, I'm Avihe. I'm from Namibia, and I'm currently a senior here at Luther. So just a few weeks left, and I'm a biology and data science major. So first, I quickly just want to start with thanking Professor Nave and Professor Mtisi for giving me the honor to introduce a truly remarkable person, Father Michael Lapsley, an Anglican priest and anti-apartheid activist whose life and work have transcended borders and transformed lives. Born on June 2nd, 1949, in New Zealand, Father Lapsley embarked on a journey that took him far away from his home and changed his life completely. After being ordained in Australia, he moved to South Africa in 1973, during the height of the apartheid regime's brutality. It was here that Father Lapsley's journey as a social justice activist began with determination. He served as a chaplain to students at the universities in Durban, actively speaking against the injustices faced by school children in the 1970s. In 1976, among the Soweto uprising, his courageous stance against apartheid led his expulsion from South Africa. He then lived in Lesotho and then in Zimbabwe, continuing his education and becoming deeply involved with the African National Congress as a chaplain and a member. Tragically, in 1990, his fight for justice nearly cost him his life. While living in Zimbabwe, Father Lapsley was sent a letter bomb by the apartheid regime, which resulted in the loss of both hands, sight in one eye, and severe burns. This brutal attack, however, did not deter him. Instead, it fueled his determination to fight against violence and to help others heal. Father Lapsley then returned to South Africa in 1992 and founded the Institute for Healing of Memories there in 1998. His work with the Institute aims to help people overcome the psychological and emotional wounds from past conflicts, promoting reconciliation and healing. While we'll all soon watch a video that will exactly say what I just said, allow me to just share what his presence here means to me personally as a Namibian. Like South Africa, Namibia bears the deep scars of apartheid, a system that not only segregated but deeply wounded our society, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. But despite the significant progress that Namibia has made, Namibia continues to face vast socioeconomic disparities. These disparities are often along racial lines, a direct inheritance of apartheid system. The journey for many Namibians towards healing and reconciliation is long and ongoing. In 1990, the year of his attack, Namibia gained independence. And just a few hours ago, I spoke to my dad, and I just asked him, what was it like at that time, around independence and the rest of 1990? And he told me that for a lot of Namibians, they were relieved, they were happy, but because of what was going on in Southern Africa, and especially in South Africa at the time, a lot of people were in doubt and were asking, is this really the end of the struggle for Namibians? Father Michael Lapsley's story of transformation and resilience resonates with the narrative of my nation, a young country forging its path forward despite the burdens of past injustices. This past J-term, 15 other Luther students and I were privileged to meet Father Lapsley in South Africa during a J-term study away led by Professor Nave and Professor Mtisi. Father Michael, as a Namibian, meeting you was and is an honor and a profound opportunity for me, especially given our shared histories and the ongoing challenges of overcoming apartheid's legacies. Your life and your work really emphasize the importance of recognizing pain and loss as essential steps towards true reconciliation and peace, and the healing of societal wounds left behind apartheid. It was more than just an educational encounter for me. It was a vivid lesson for me in courage and the power of forgiveness. Your work with the Institute for Healing of Memories offers vital lessons for Namibians as we too fight to reconcile and heal. Your message is a reminder that our past, filled with pain and conflict, is a foundation on which we can build a future of unity and peace. Father Father Lapsley's contributions to social justice and healing have been recognized worldwide. He has received multiple honorary doctorates and awards, including the prestigious Queen's Service Medal from the New Zealand government and the Niwano Peace Award in Japan. His story has been captured in biographical works like Priest and Pattison, A South African Journey, with a foreword by Nelson Mandela, who referred to Father Lapsley's life as a compelling metaphor for the struggle against apartheid. So we really are blessed by your servantship. Your impact extends beyond South Africa, and your work is not only important to the South African community, but to Namibians, to Africans, to the wider world, and especially to us here today as a Decorah and a Luther community. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your life to be here with us. And I'll just end with a quote by Father Lapsley that invites us to reflect our role in shaping our future unchained from past injustices. Here goes. Despite our past, we have a mandate to become architects of our future. Let us not be prisoners of our history, but active participants in writing a story of healing and hope. So as we welcome Father Michael Lapsley today, let us be inspired by his resilience and commitment to justice and peace. So with that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Father Michael Lapsley.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you, my sister, for a very, it's good to have our own little Southern Africa. Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, and I'm here with my brother, Pilani Dlamini, also from South Africa. Your prize for good behavior is we're going to show you a movie now.
Father Michael Lapsley was born in New Zealand on June 2nd, 1949.
I was born and brought up in New Zealand, this very small country. And my parents, in terms of the developed country, were quite poor. So I remember hard work, lack of money, but not poverty in the sense of ever having gone to bed hungry. Both my parents were loving, committed Christians, so I was brought up very much in a church environment, and since I was a child, was quite a religious child and interested in issues of faith.
His interest in issues of faith grew into a calling, and at the age of 17, he traveled to Australia to become a priest in the Anglican Church.
At the end of high school, I went to begin my training to be a priest. In some ways, when I look back, it's quite amazing that they actually permitted me at the age of 17 to leave the country, go to another country, and to train to be a priest.
Michael Lapsley joined the Anglican religious community in Australia in 1967. In 1971, he took his vows in the Society of the Sacred Mission. Lapsley was ordained as a priest in 1973. In that same year, the community chose to transfer him to South Africa to enroll in undergraduate studies in the city of Durban. It was in South Africa that Father Michael's life would be changed forever.
Nothing prepared me for South Africa. I had read and read and read, and yet I understood nothing as I look back. And I suppose I thought that when I arrived in South Africa, I'd find three groups of people: the oppressed, the oppressor, and, if you like, the human race that I would belong to. And I often say that when I arrived in South Africa, I stopped being a human being and I became a white man. Because from the moment of my arrival, every single aspect of my life was decided by the color of my skin.
Fate landed Father Michael in South Africa during the height of the apartheid repression and escalating violence. Far from being an ordinary student, his appointment as chaplain to both white students and black students on 3 campuses gave him a unique perspective.
I wasn't simply living in this white cocoon of white privilege, but I was seeing day by day and relating to people who were at the receiving end of racial oppression and feeling its wrongness and its injustice.
For Father Michael, this would be a test of faith. What does a man of God do in the face of injustice?
From earliest childhood, had an understanding of Christianity that meant that all human beings were made in God's image and likeness. All human beings had value simply because we're human. My experience from the day I arrived in South Africa was this was the very opposite of Christianity. Because here was a society in which all value derived from the color of your skin, not from the commonness of your humanity.
While theological questions of right and wrong, good and evil, swirled in his mind, Father Michael was faced with a very practical question of which side was he on, the oppressed or the oppressor?
In a way, I suppose, from the beginning, I guess I had, in a crude sense, 2 choices: beat them or join them. And I guess in my heart of hearts, I decided to beat them. Very increasingly, my life became committed to ending that system.
Over the next 3 years, Father Michael spoke out against the injustices of apartheid and became active in the anti-apartheid movement. It all came to a head in 1976 when school children began to protest having to learn their lessons in Afrikaans and the fact that the education they were receiving was inferior.
During that period of more than a year, more than 1,000 school children were shot in the streets of South Africa. And then vast numbers were detained, imprisoned, tortured. Shortly after that, I was then expelled from South Africa. I had begun to speak out against the killing of children, but also against the torture young people. But when I was expelled, there was no formal reason even. And so then, in agreement with my community, I went to live in Lesotho, where my community had also been working for a long time.
After being expelled in September of 1976, Father Michael moved to Lesotho, where he continued his studies and joined the African National Congress. He became one of the chaplains to the ANC in exile.
Philosophically, theologically, I was immensely attracted immediately to the ANC. The stumbling block was that I was a committed pacifist, and the ANC, after 15 years of non-violent struggle, had actually opted for arms. But the killing of schoolchildren pushed me over the edge, and I began to say, in this context, as a last resort, when all other options, all other avenues are closed, people do have a right to defend themselves. And so, if you like, the last hurdle had been crossed that made it possible for me to join the African National Congress of South Africa.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is on the savage text on an unarmed and defenseless people.
In 1982, 100 South African commandos raided the city of Maseru, Lesotho, in search of ANC members who were believed to be in hiding. 42 people were killed, including 5 women and 2 children. After the attack, Father Michael moved to Zimbabwe.
As years passed, we became the hunted. By the time I left Lesotho, you never drove a car without looking underneath it to see whether a bomb had been placed there.
It was in Zimbabwe in 1990, 3 months after ANC leader Nelson Mandela's release from prison, that Father Michael was sent a letter bomb by the apartheid regime. It was hidden inside of 2 religious magazines. He lost both hands and sight in one eye in the blast and was seriously burned.
We know that it was part of the machinery of the apartheid state. It wasn't an individual act, but it was part of the machineries of death of the apartheid state that endured beyond 1990.
The act of opening the magazine was the detonating device for a bomb. I can still remember what happened. The actual explosion, there's still something with me. I remember pain of a scale that I didn't think a human being could ever experience. I remember going into darkness, being thrown backwards by the force of the bomb. The exact angle saved my life that I opened it. I opened it on a small coffee table. If I'd opened it on something like this, a table like this, it would have killed me because it would have knocked out the heart or knocked off the head. But I'd always been clear that the person I hold responsible ultimately for my bombing is FW de Klerk. I suppose said that I'm not filled with hatred or bitterness or self-pity, nor that I want revenge. I think what I believe in is not retribution. I believe in restorative justice. If FW was to come to me, or the person who made the bomb was to come to me and said, I'm sorry for what I did, and I want your forgiveness, and this is what I am now doing in the way of reparation, not to me personally, but to our country and our people. These are the kinds of things I'm doing to heal our land. Then of course one would say, of course, yes, forgiveness. There would not be a problem about that.
Father Michael returned to South Africa in 1992. He became the chaplain of the Trauma Center for Victims of Violence and Torture in Cape Town. The center assisted South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was there that he became aware of the tremendous healing power of telling your story.
All South Africa had been damaged by the experience of the apartheid, no matter what side they were on. Also that all of us had a story to tell. All of us carried stuff inside of us as a consequence of the journey the nation had travelled.
This work led to the founding of the Institute for the Healing of Memory in 1998.
This workshop is a journey. It's a journey that is going to focus not so much on what we think, but on what we feel.
He started giving workshops that enabled South Africans of all races to tell their stories of pain and trauma.
Your heroic determination,
your commitment to justice, being proud.
It helped me to open up. I think it's there that I managed to say things that I never even told my mother.
I was able to express myself, my story, my feelings. And for the first time, somebody was listening.
I cried for all the pain of the apartheid that affected my life. I cried because of all the anger.
I could put my arm on the shoulder of people that I've never been so close to before. And that, for me as a white person, it meant a tremendous lot to me.
Father Michael soon realized that telling these stories in a safe, supportive environment helped to start the process of healing. He believes that the entire human family is burdened with trauma of one kind or another because of what we've done, what was done to us, and what we have failed to do. Therefore, everyone, young and old, rich and poor, could benefit by telling their story. Father Michael now travels throughout Africa, Europe, North America, and the South Pacific, giving healing of memory workshops to help heal the world, one story at a time.
At some point in everybody's life, there's some kind of trauma from which they need to heal. But where people have been particularly oppressed, where people have gone through situations of war or oppression, then there is an even greater need for healing to take place. And so human beings everywhere need to find a way of detoxifying, if you like, vomiting out the poison of the things that have happened to them, so that they may indeed integrate into their lives what has happened, but also lead free, fulfilling, and whole lives.
Thank you very much. Before I speak, I'm going to invite you all to speak to each other. I'm told that on special occasions at Luther, you're allowed to talk to each other. And also, I need to, of course, welcome those from different parts of the world who are with us on live streaming. And so to them, as well as to you, I invite you just to speak to your neighbor. If you haven't got a neighbor, there's always the person behind you. And just to, what touched you? What struck you? What questions do you have? So just for a couple of minutes, sharing with your neighbor. I'm sorry to force husbands and wives to speak to each other. I know that's but I'm sure tonight you're willing. Just for a couple of minutes, and then I will continue to speak. Thank you. It's a nice audience.
And so then you go in there and just ask them to kind of hold the conversation for the Q&A. Yeah. That's good.
This is a beautiful building. This is very lovely, this building. I mean, the way it's designed is, it kind of creates... So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm thinking of going home now because I can see you've got plenty to say to each other. And I'm happy to have provided this occasion. Also, as my brother did, I want to acknowledge the ancient people, the first foundation nations of the human family who lived on this sacred ground. The title of tonight is Healing the Wounds of History. And I want to also focus on the ideas of knowledge and acknowledgement. It fits very beautifully with this first acknowledgement of land. Also speaking a little bit about journeys of forgiveness as well. And also a little bit talking about moral and spiritual injury, but with the overarching healing the wounds of history. And I want to use some of my own story to illustrate the points I want to make. But I must say it's a delight to be here at Luther. I've never been to Iowa. I've been to many parts of the United States over many years, but never to Iowa, never to Luther. And my brothers have come to South Africa over the years, and it was time to return the compliment and to come here. And I must say it has been very beautiful, the interactions that we've had together over the last couple of days, which will continue tomorrow. As I say, I want to illustrate some of my own story to make some points. And I want to go back to that experience of being bombed. Before I was bombed, I had lived in the countries of Southern Africa, in Lesotho and Zimbabwe. But I traveled the world as part of the struggle against apartheid. As we heard, I was part of the liberation movement, the African National Congress of South Africa, and my responsibility there was to mobilize the faith community internationally and to say across the world that apartheid was not simply a justice issue, a human rights issue, a political issue, but it was a faith issue. Because the apartheid regime claimed to be Christian, claimed divine guidance. They even wrote into the last white constitution, guided by God from generation to generation. A tribute to a racist God. So, because of my journeys around the world, when I was bombed, I received messages of prayer, love, support from across the world, from Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, communists. So, and I want to say the same point in some different language. So my story was acknowledged, reverenced, recognized, and given a moral content. People said what happened to me was wrong. But I want to pause for a moment with this idea of acknowledgement. And I want to make the distinction between knowledge and acknowledgement. So for example, maybe there is abuse happening in a family. Everybody knows it's happening, but it's a guilty secret. There's knowledge, but there's no acknowledgement. And we can think of many contexts around the world where this issue of acknowledgement has been on the table for a long time. And of course, acknowledgement also links to the whole question of apology. I learned something very particular in relation of knowledge and acknowledgement from the Sami people. Anybody know who are they?
Indigenous people from Finland.
Pardon?
The indigenous people from Finland.
Norway, Sweden,
Yeah.
some into
Yeah.
Russia as well. And we've done work in Norway, Sweden, Finland. And in Norway, the Sami people said to me, our king has acknowledged the part of Norway and the oppression of the Sami people. So there was acknowledgement. See, the problem is, for most of the society, there's no knowledge about what was being acknowledged. So, thank you for the acknowledgement. How much do we know? How much do we actually know? Well, how much knowledge do we have about the peoples whose land Luther is on? I often feel in the United States that most of white America has no comprehension of the pain which is black America. So knowledge and acknowledgement are both useful tools here in the United States and all over the world, as important in the journey of healing. I like to think of my own journey as a journey from being a victim, which I was, to being a survivor, which I am, but to being victorious. If terrible things happen to us, there's likely to be one of two journeys. One is the journey of victims who become victimizers, who become victims, who become victimizers. intergenerational. Equally true of individuals, communities, and nations. And people give themselves permission to do terrible things to others because of what was done to them. Think of September the 11th. The nation that had the sympathy of the whole world, but then became the victimizer and didn't care whether it was the same people who had done it or not. But we're having this conversation in the United States. I can have this conversation all over the world, so don't feel picked on. Because we're talking about the human family. We work in prisons in different places. There's this huge amount of evidence. Not all, but those who do the most terrible things to others were victims before they became victimizers. We've worked for many years with military veterans, both in South Africa and in the United States. Now we know in the United States that more veterans commit suicide than die in battle. So the victimization becomes the victimization of self, either with horror, terrible thing of suicide, or of drugs, or of alcohol. So you either victimize others, or you victimize self. And what has become more, we're hearing more and more about, an area that was in complete silence, is abuse within military families. There was silence about that, but clearly that was happening for a very long time. So the question is, how do we break the cycle that turns victims into victimizers? And I would suggest to you that often the key to breaking that cycle, again, is the power of acknowledgement. We were doing some work in Hawaii. Some would say that's an oxymoron. Who's ever heard of people working in Hawaii? Except, of course, the highest level of homelessness in the United States, disproportionate number of indigenous people in the prison system within Hawaii. It was a workshop with women, and they were speaking of abuse across generations. And myself and my colleague were the only two men in the workshop. And at some point, I felt moved to say, I feel guilt and shame as a man for what you've experienced as women. And one of the women began to cry, and she said, never, never in my life have I heard a man say, I'm sorry for what happened to you as women. Now, I was not the one who had abused them, but I'm a man. And so that significance of being heard and acknowledged. My brother Pilani and I were just with the Inuit people in the northern part of Quebec. It's slightly colder than here. and at the end of the workshop, where they've been telling each other their stories, one of the women said, I've never felt so important in my whole life. I never felt so important in my whole life. And that speaks to the deepest kind of healing, when you feel of value. So, as I say, my story, acknowledged, reverenced, recognized, but also, just as Nelson Mandela said when he left prison, he said, if I did not leave hatred and bitterness at the prison door, I would still be in prison. So I realized that if I was filled with hatred and bitterness and desire for revenge, that I would be a victim forever. They would have failed to kill the body, but they would have killed the soul. So what I'm also suggesting is this massive support that I had created the spiritual space for me to maneuver and to make that step towards victory. You know, if terrible things happen to us, life is like a river. The river flows, something terrible happens, and our life so often becomes a whirlpool. We live life in terms of that terrible moment. But the sharing of the story in a safe space can be where the river begins to flow again. So I returned to South Africa. I'd been away for 16 years after I'd been bombed and been to hospital and all that. When I returned to South Africa, I discovered a wounded nation, a nation wounded in our humanity. And we heard that in the film, wounded by what we'd done, by what had been done to us, and by what we failed to do. And all of us with a story to tell. But unlike me, for millions of South Africans, their stories had not been acknowledged, reverenced, recognized. They had not been prayed for, loved, and supported. So I began to discover a new vocation. I'd been a freedom fighter for the previous 16 years, and I found a calling to be a healer. When I say that, people say, "Okay, Father, so how many people have you healed?" I say, probably none. But I know that I've helped create spaces where healing happens. Now, the story you've heard, okay, a Kiwi boy, all of that, but essentially, it's a South African story. In the same year that the Institute was founded, 1998, we were invited to two places. Rwanda, 4 years after the genocide, and a place you vaguely heard of called New York City. And the workshop we had in New York City was at a church you have heard of, Riverside Church. And at that workshop, many of the people who were there had been in the civil rights movement, but they said it was the first time they had an opportunity to speak about their pain. So we began to be invited across the globe. I'm not quite sure why, but I've not yet been invited anywhere where there's total peace and harmony. Maybe it exists somewhere, but I haven't yet had that invitation. But I began to see that woundedness is the story of the human family. That none of us will walk this earthly life without wounding other people and without being wounded. So the question is not, are we wounded or not? Yes, we all are. The question is, how do we respond? But particularly where people have experienced war and oppression. What's interesting in our work across the whole globe, sometimes working with military veterans, working with people HIV positive, working with refugees, the two most frequent stories are childhood trauma and gender-based violence across the whole globe. So even when we are talking to military veterans, some of them do talk about what being in war meant to them, but frequently it's about childhood. And so that helped us to discover that healing of memories is relevant to the whole human family. And Luther has got some faith community tendencies, also within the faith community. The faith community is a source of life and comfort and inspiration, but it's also so often a place of hurt as well. And sometimes, you know, as people of faith, we love God, we love everybody, we have the nice religious talk, but meanwhile, it's another story inside of us. I remember a veteran in Arizona saying, "I've waited 42 years to tell this story." How beautiful that he was telling his story after 42 years. How tragic that for 42 years the damage had been taking place until finally he was able to share. But I want to move the conversation slightly and focus a little bit with military veterans. I think you all know the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a correct description in terms of, what's it called, the DSM-4, in terms of you know, the psychological diagnostic tools. But it's used a little bit too much in a blanket way. And this is the way that I want to talk about it. If a young person, man, woman, grows up and joins the military, we put uniforms on them and we say, we give you permission to kill people, but it's not murder, because we've given you permission. But old soldiers have cried themselves to sleep throughout history. Because the system, governments all over the world throughout history give permission, but the problem is you have violated the moral code. Because you've grown, all of us grow up, that killing people is wrong. So no matter what the commanding officer may have said, there has been moral injury. Why do you think so many Vietnam vets had to go back to Vietnam? It wasn't to deal with PTSD, it was to deal with moral injury. Moral injury, breaking the moral code. It's most dramatic in terms of the military, but it's true in many other circumstances. So a pill, what do they call it, say, EMDR, various psychological interventions, in the end can't deal with moral injury. It's what you need to do to quieten your conscience, how you have to go back and do penance. If you like, the ancient teaching of the church, to have contrition, to be able to make it up in the ways that are possible, possibly to the person you violated, but often simply to the society. But also, as Christians, as Muslims, as Jews, we believe that all people are made in God's image and likeness. And we have value, and not just we have value, there's something of the divine in all of us. And so, when I attack you, I attack the divine in you and the divine in myself. I suppose we see it captured so beautifully with our Hindu sisters and brothers. Namaste, namaste. I bow before the divine in you as the divine in myself. So I hope if you're not, there's more and more literature about moral injury, but there's not so much about spiritual injury. But I hope you find that helpful to reflect on that. Now, acknowledgement, knowledge, moral and spiritual injury. Let's come to that lovely word, forgiveness. I think in the description of tonight, we said we were going to speak about that. Is that right? Have I forgotten anything else?
Yeah, I forgot it.
You know, when I tell my story, I say, I'm not full of hatred, I'm not bitter, I don't want revenge. Then I sit down and some nice person stands up and says, Father, you're a beautiful example of forgiveness. I said, but excuse me, I didn't actually mention the word forgiveness. You see, in my case, as I stand here tonight at Luther, I don't know who sent me the bomb. I don't know who made it. I don't know the chain of command. I don't even know why they made that decision. So in a sense, for me, forgiveness is not on the table. But in my mind, I imagine an encounter with the person who sent me the bomb. Now, the imagined encounter may not be the same as the real flesh and blood one when the person is there. But in my imagination, I knock on the door. I'm the one who sent you the bomb. Will you forgive me? What do I say? Yes, no, not yet. Or, excuse me, sir, do you still make letter bombs? She says, no. Actually, I work in the local hospital. Will you forgive me? Yes, sir, I forgive you. And personally, I would prefer that you spend the rest of your life working in that hospital, because I believe 1,000 times more in the justice of restoration than the justice of punishment. So often when we say justice, we mean punishment, if not revenge. But there's another kind of justice, the justice of restoring relationships. But then perhaps we sit down and we drink tea and I say, my friend, I've forgiven you, but I still have no hands. I've forgiven you, but I still only have one eye. My eardrums are still damaged. I'll always need someone to assist me for the rest of my life. Of course, you will help pay for that person, not as a condition of forgiveness, but as part of reparation and restitution in the ways that are possible. Forgiveness is one of our key words in the Christian community. And because of that, people often hear forgiveness spoken of as something glib and cheap and easy. But most people I meet across the world tell me it's costly, it's painful, it's difficult. And in fact, when I preach about forgiveness at the church door, again and again people say to me, the most helpful thing you said to us today was that forgiveness is costly, painful, and difficult. Because we felt there was something wrong with us, that we weren't finding it easy to forgive. Now, if I could say something quite harsh in a way, well-meaning Christians, often use forgiveness as a weapon against hurting people, out of good motivation. Because when I'm hurting, I need acknowledgement. I need a hug, not a sermon about forgiveness. And then perhaps one day I might choose a journey of forgiveness. So on this point, I want to speak out both sides of my mouth. This side of my mouth, I would say that let's beware of weaponizing forgiveness. Let's think about acknowledging people's pain. The other side of my mouth, I meet people all over the world for whom forgiveness is the key to their healing. That they cannot proceed in their lives. And I've had many encounters with people who said, I decided to forgive because I couldn't continue in my life until I was able to forgive. It's very interesting in the Greek of the New Testament. The word for forgiveness, aphiemi, is the same word as untying a knot. So where there's unforgiveness, we are the prisoners of each other. Now I want to suggest to you that forgiveness is not primarily about the other person. It's about ourselves. It's about what I call healthy selfishness, so that we may be free and different from reconciliation. Sad to say, in patriarchal churches, one of the things we have to repent of is how often we male clergy have told women to go back into abusive relationships. You must forgive them. And many women have died because of that, where often it's more appropriate to say, if that's how you feel, darling, I forgive you, but I'll never live with you again. Darling, I forgive you, but I'll never live with you again. Because I sufficiently love myself. It's interesting, the commandment in the Bible is love your neighbor as yourself. And part of the woundedness people often experience is the lack of self-love. And I meet so many people in our workshops who tell stories. As a child, I was told I was rubbish, and I began to believe it. And perhaps I often think that the deepest wounds of racism, of course they are political and economic, but the deepest wounds are spiritual. The wounds that people come to believe themselves to be second class, believe themselves to be inferior. And I hear that with people of color, I hear that in the First Nations of the world. And so the journey of healing is that recovery, like I said, the woman, the Inuit woman who said, I've never felt so important in all my life. And then you know the journey to healing has happened. I think I would like to pause at this moment, but again, just for a minute, speak to your neighbor again, and then His Excellency, Professor Nave, is going to ask me some questions. But just speak again for your neighbor. What's touching you? What's striking you? And then he's going to ask me some questions, and then we're going to open it up to you. But so far, so good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we'll come back in 2 days. We can have it. This is now a Healing of Memories workshop. Keep talking for 2 more days and we shall return. Okay, Professor Guy.
Now, we've been visiting with Father Michael. I think our first visit with Father Michael was 2003. We've been visiting, we've been making this trip down there for quite some time. And as we were preparing for tonight, I've known Father Michael long enough. I was like, Father Michael, we don't need to have a conversation. I'd rather be sitting on that side to take in, because I always take in. So it'd just be easy for me to say, no, let's have a conversation. I said, okay, all right, but I think I'd rather be there. And we see, we didn't need a, I may ask one question, just because I'm up here. Not for the sake of having a conversation, but because I'm up here, I may ask one question. But I think we want to turn it to the audience so that you can ask questions, because we've been asking each other questions and having conversations for almost 20 years now.
Right.
We're just honored to have him here. So I guess my presence up here doesn't seem like a complete waste. Maybe I'll ask one thing. When you were talking, and the work about healing of memories, right? The work of the healing of memories, and then you talked about forgiveness. In your video, you made reference to the machinery, that I recognized it was machinery at work, right? You know, when you're talking about the letter bomb, it's machinery that's
the apartheid machinery,
part of machinery, right? And I wonder how in the work of the healing of memories, because oftentimes we think of the memory as something that's just in the past, right? And I wonder how we work on healing memories when there's a machinery that's still at work, right? And so that past experience isn't just in the past, because there's this machinery that's at work, right? And so I'm continuing to experience, and so I'm trying to heal a memory, but yet I'm continuing to experience because I'm in a machinery, right? I'm in a system that's at work, and so you know, when you're working on healing memories, how do you go about addressing the reality that for some people, for many people, it's not just there's a
past.
There's a systemic racism that continues continues to go on, and so the experience that I had back then is still being reinforced by a system that continues to do this stuff to me, and so how do I heal that? How do I work on the healing of that memory when that memory is continuing to just be fresh and new consistently? And connected to that also is the forgiveness, right? Because how do I forgive a system it's easier for an individual, right? But how do I forgive a system, and how do I heal from a machinery in a system that's ongoing?
Yeah, let me start with the last part. I don't think we're supposed to forgive systems. We're supposed to demolish them, you know, not heal them. But again, in some ways, I want to speak out both sides of my mouth. If Nelson Mandela had not been on a healing journey during the 27 years he was in prison, if he'd come out of prison and said, it's time to get the bastards, we could have died in our millions. So clearly, and this is incredibly important, particularly with leaders, that they be on, and I think there's plenty of examples in the world today of unhealed leaders who can play a majorly destructive role to their society. So again, that's one side of my mouth, but I remember teaching mainly African American students Manhattanville College in New York State, and they were making precisely that point. But we go on having these experiences of racism. It's not stopping. So what does healing? So in a sense, in that context, it's the need to endure is on the cards rather. And the same in South Africa. There were those in the 1980s who said, we just need to reconcile. Let's come together and sing black and white together and everything is okay, but keep apartheid in place. No, we needed to slay the monster. So then, and at that point, healing comes onto the agenda. But the but is that, you see, there's a very important realization in the healing journey. And that's where I say, And I had permission to say, I'm full of hate, I'm bitter, I want revenge. There's a key moment where I, like an Archimedes moment, but it's destroying me. But it's destroying me. Because that's when healing becomes possible. However, there will be new traumas that happen. I mentioned the guy, the veteran who says, I've waited 42 years to tell this story. One would hope, having been in a healing of memories process, that he has learned the importance of finding safe spaces where I can share what is inside me and have companions on the way. So if you like, I can become healthier to continue the struggle for justice. We like to frame all our work in healing of memories as a relationship between healing and justice. Now, I believe that one or two of you here have some Christian tendencies. I may be wrong, but I have a suspicion. See, at least somebody laughed. That's always encouraging. It's very interesting, in the New Testament, healing is again and again not an end in itself. And Scripture says they were healed and then they followed Jesus on the way. So healing is connected to discipleship. So healing is about the recovery of agency. So that, in the way I like to think of it, is so that we can participate in God's dream. So that we can participate in God's dream. And when we are prisoners of moments in history, all our energy is with our victimhood. And that's why I said, in a way, why I do the work that I do, because the millions of South Africans, all they had was their victimhood. So there was no spiritual, emotional space to move out of it. But you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, people correctly talk about continuous stress disorder. But there's still the importance of becoming healthier. But often the energy that's needed, as I say, is for endurance. And of course, if we spoke about anger, I believe hatred is always destructive. I believe that kindness is always life-giving. Anger is different. If the people of South Africa did not get angry, we would have apartheid today in the Constitution. We didn't, because the people of South Africa got angry. And that mobilized us to fight for justice. At the same time, when I remain angry, it consumes me. It takes over my life and easily leads to hatred and revenge. So while anger is a motivating force for justice everywhere, we need to transform it into the vision of what we want. So we in the end are driven by not what we're against, but by what we're for. Which is a vision, in the end, a vision of love. But thank you. Why did you ask me the most difficult question of all?
I was only going to ask one. So
I thought we were friends.
I was only going to ask one. And so we're going to open it up because we've been having conversations, like I say, for 2 decades now. And, and we could do this. I could do this. But I want to afford others the opportunity to...
and maybe there could be a question or a short comment or a feeling. Maybe not quite as long a speech as mine, but...
Yes, so we've got a couple of floating mics that will be going around. So if you have a question, a comment, and if it is a question, make sure it's a question, so we can kind of get to it and get to the next one. So show of hands, question. We've got students that want to get us started. A question, like there's one way in the back there. So and then a second one can go up because we have 2 mics, and so we'll just run the next one to the other one, so you can jump right in.
All right.
Is there another question while he's asking?
Do you want me to stay back here, or?
No, you can ask it from there, bro.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name's Gideon Misa. Friar, thank you. Professor Nave, Avihe, Professor Matisse, thank you guys. But I just wanted to start off with a comment regarding forgiveness, and this is just a little bit about my testimony and being a believer. When I was 10 years old, my father, he left my time for a period of time, and I remember it was Father's Day, and my siblings and I, we were in the backyard, and we had the idea, all right, let's go on the concrete, let's draw on the sidewalk, and we'll draw like Happy Father's Day. We'll get chalk, we'll get flowers from our backyard, thinking that my dad will be able to see through the airplane flying to Ghana. He'll be able to see our gift. And when I had the realization like a few days later that he wasn't coming back, I remember instantly being the oldest out of 4 children. I always blamed it on myself, and I always put that burden on myself, and I had the hatred and the unforgiveness in my heart. And throughout time, I believe it was 3 years later, it was on my 13th birthday, I was in 7th grade, and I remember getting a call from my middle school, and they're like, would you like to talk to your father? And I'm like, man, what the heck is going on? You know, and I was just in utter shock. And I remember that's what really like expedited the process of the hatred in my heart. And I remember like just over time and over time and over time, it was a realization that it wasn't my fault. And it was a realization that forgiveness had to come to heal myself, and it had to come through the Lord. It couldn't come from anything else. And thinking about the process of forgiveness, just doing the calculations in my mind, this happened when I was 10 years old. I didn't fully forgive my father until I was 17. And from that point on, I'm 20 years right now. The relationship I have with my father now is stronger than it's ever been before. So I'm able to share that testimony to tell people that it may not get better initially, but over time, you have the ability to just be able to not overcome it through your own power, but I believe through the Lord Jesus Christ. So my question for you, Friar, is what was the process of healing and forgiveness? What did it look like to you, not only physically, but also spiritually and emotionally? So,
Firstly, let's give you a clap for what happened with your dad. I mean, the books about forgiveness say you must do this and do this and do this. Reality is forgiveness is messy. And it's also unique to particular individuals. But you spoke in terms of your own journey of the power of God, what often in the church we call grace. And I think often, because forgiveness is not small, it's huge, we need the power from God, sometimes to even want to forgive. But you also give witness to how many years it took you. It wasn't 5 minutes, it was year after year. And then eventually it became possible. And that then is liberating. And as I've said in my own journey, I remain open to it, but I don't know what it means to forgive an abstraction. If you know, feel free, you know? But I personally don't know what that means. But I also want to suggest to you that healing of memories is always, always, always on the table. Because always, always, always is me dealing with my stuff throughout my whole life. Forgiveness is sometimes the issue. But as I said, sometimes it's about the hug, it's about being heard, it's about being acknowledged. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Honestly.
It's your evening exercise. You don't have to go to the gym tonight. You're covered.
Pastor Melissa, I'm college pastor here. And in my own theological journey, a really formative theologian and text for me is Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination, in which he in part talks about the role of prophet as being able to tell and speak the truth about the difficult things, to pierce the numbness of the prevailing society. So to tell the hard things so that we can recognize the hard things, so that we can then do the work that needs to be done about the hard things. And that sometimes it is only through hearing those difficult things that we're able to actually start to begin to do the work and not just ignore what might be rumbling under the surface. And so I'm curious, your work, a lot of it is very personal, this healing of memories, being able to share stories as a way of healing ourselves and come to peace and start that journey of healing and reconciliation as individuals. But I'm curious about your experience also of the power of some of those same stories to do that work of piercing the numbness of wider society in that work of acknowledgement and knowledge at the same time. So how have you seen that unfold, or what are your thoughts about the power of these stories, not just for individual healing, but to start to pierce a society that sometimes tries to just not pay attention?
Yes, no, thank you for that. First, I just want to make the point that going to my therapist, my priest, my pastor, whatever, can be incredibly valuable. But there's a dimension of healing that only happens in a collective process. Because when I come to you and tell you my story, your response probably won't be, you think you're messed up, wait till you hear my story. So in one sense, it's a bit of a one-way street. But where we sit in a group of 6 people, 5 or 6 people, and each of us tells our story, we become the healers of one another. And often as I listen to your story, it is a mirror of my own. And sometimes maybe you tell your story as a story of defeat, but everybody else in the group hears as a story of victory. So we actually give you a new pair of spectacles to tell your story. You know, during our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for nearly 5 years, it was broadcast every single night. We as a nation, we listened to the stories. Incidentally, huge parts of the white community turned off the TV, turned off the radio. Because in a sense, to watch was to have to deal with guilt and shame. Not just what I did, but what was done in my name and on my behalf. But there was a couple of stories that relate to the point you're making. There was a woman who had been, now the story is broadcast, and it appears in Archbishop Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness. And she came to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a white woman, and she had been shot up by a group of black guerrilla fighters who attacked this golf club. And when she appeared at the commission, she still had shrapnel in her body. But she gobsmacked the country, because what she said is, she said, I would like to meet those young men who came and shot up at the golf club, because I want to ask their forgiveness for what I did in my life that led them to do what they did. You know? So it was the opposite of what people had expected. So that's one story that challenges a nation. The other is a US South African story. And that's the story of the Beals, the story of Amy Beal, a young US exchange student in the early 90s. She goes to South Africa. In fact, all her friends were black, but she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And a group of young black people coming from a political meeting saw her and killed her. And her parents came to South Africa, and they supported amnesty for the guys who took their daughter's life. Not only that, they started an organization and employed 2 of those young men in their organization. And that was, again, it confronted the country. I was on a radio program with the mother, Linda, and Linda said on this radio program, she said, in terms of her faith, there was never any other issue but forgiveness. Right? And it was one of those phone-in programs, and a woman phoned up beside herself with anger and said, how dare you? How dare you? Because, of course, what the woman who phoned up was saying, I couldn't forgive, and because you have, that confronts me with my inability to forgive. So indeed, obviously Nelson Mandela is the famous story, the most famous. But one of the things I said at the time that the Mandela went to heaven, there were many Nelson Mandelas in South Africa. There were many, many, many who suffered greatly, but were not consumed by bitterness. But what I've learned as well that, and this came up in one of our conversations, I think yesterday with Marina, quoting Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I could find profound meaning out of my story. My story leads to a worldwide organization of healing of memories. But often the relative of the victim finds it much harder to heal because the relative often feels they owe it to their loved one who's now dead to keep hatred alive. There's a woman came to a workshop, and it sounds horrible, but on the first night of the workshop, I was struck by the ugliness of her face. And she told a story of her son that had been killed 13 years previously. And as she told the story, it's like it happened in the last 5 minutes. And at one point I said to her, what kind of life do you think your son would have wished for you? And in the process of the workshop, she began to let him rest. Not to forget him, but to let him rest. And on the last day of the workshop, I could have walked straight past her because the physical lines of her face had changed. Her face had become radiant. So it was the first day of the rest of her life. But those are a couple of stories too. And one of the reasons why one should keep getting on these damn planes and visiting people around the world. I would hope that the stories that Pelani and I are sharing, we hope they inspire you, they encourage you, because we all need that. We all need to be encouraged and inspired. And Zoom is wonderful. Zoom helped us survive COVID, but we're creatures of flesh and blood, We need to be able to hug and embrace and kiss and all of that. So I was going to say hold hands, but sorry, I don't have hands. But in a serious way, God made us creatures of flesh and blood, which is why we need to visit as well. And that's what's so beautiful about these visits that you guys have made, because you meet the people, the real people, and you listen and learn from them. I still have this rather challenging suggestion that I think everyone in the United States needs to get a passport. And then they need to go to the hospital and get their lips sewn up. And then they should go and visit the peoples of the world and listen and feel. And then come back to the United States, then we'll undo the lips, and then they can talk about, the world. I think also, South Africans and people in the United States, we have some of the same diseases. We are arrogant in Africa, inappropriately. The US is arrogant inappropriately in the world. And we need the humility to say, the peoples of the world have so much to teach us, for the sake of our own humanity. But thank you, my sister. Thank you.
Okay, they often say that so much similarities between USA and South Africa, right? Like in terms of, I know South Africa, the blacks are majority, in America, the blacks are minority. And for example, apartheid is happening during Jim Crow era. And you can't ignore and compare. For example, Steve Biko is normally compared to Malcolm X, that kind of thing. What do you think is the similarities? Because it almost seems like South African apartheid regime was drawing some rules from Jim Crow's America. It's almost hard to distinguish these two countries in terms of their...
Can you hear the question? I can't hear.
You have to remember that it's hearing because...
Okay, so I was saying it's hard to distinguish between America and South Africa in terms of laws. The only big difference is that South Africa blacks were majority, USA blacks are minority, for example. And I think when you look at laws, in South Africa, it almost seems like they're copying what America was doing in terms of racial, like Jim Crow era, like in terms of like Europeans only place, black only place. What do you think about that?
So the similarities between segregation in the United States and apartheid in South Africa, and how are they similar in light of the fact that blacks were the majority in South Africa and blacks are the minority in America?
No, thank you. I think that what you're pointing to is fundamental. To be a majority in your own land means that tactics are going to be very different from when you're a minority in your own land. Obviously, the underlying reality is racism. And like slavery, it has its roots in greed. In greed. You dehumanize others for the benefit of super profits. Because if the people are as human in exactly the same way as you are, you couldn't do what you did. No? So you take away the humanity of the other. And of course in South Africa we had slavery in the Cape with people from other parts of Africa enslaved, brought to South Africa, and also from Asia, from Myanmar and Sri Lanka and all those countries. So there is a commonality. So it's both commonality and difference. And the tragedy of South Africa, that a minority held a majority hostage. And that was with the power of guns and the power of ideology. And the major ideological weapon of the apartheid state was a perversion of the Christian gospel. And also you move hope from this life to the next. Don't worry, you're oppressed, you'll go to heaven at the end. No? So bad theology. But I think you have your share of bad theology in the United States. Wherever any of the great faith traditions are used as a justification to oppress people, it's an abuse of that faith tradition. I met a very wise man in Sri Lanka many years ago. He said, don't look at what is done in the name of a religion. Don't look at what is done in the name of the founder of a religion. Look at the key teachings of that religion. And in the key teaching of all the great religions, there's kindness, generosity, justice, dignity. And I think myself, I want to beware of all the fundamentalisms. I long knew that Christianity's fundamentalism was terrible. I was unimpressed by the fundamentalism of Islam. I was unimpressed with the fundamentalism of Hinduism. I thought, well, thank God the Buddhists are okay. And then I went to Sri Lanka and Myanmar. And damn it, they've also got... Because the point about the fundamentalisms, eventually they lead to violence, you know? Because you have a certainty about yourself and a denial of the humanity of others, which is where I think faith and doubt go together. And faith and doubt are two sides of the same coin. And that lack of certainty, I think, enables us to remain open-hearted and to be able to grow. But also your question raises the key issue of, one of the few good things, if you like, that came out of the horror of the murder of George Floyd and the long line of black men and some black women was the beginning of a conversation about white privilege. And for me, that's a sign of hope. Because before that, say, okay, I'm a white person, I'm against racism. Can we talk about something else? Instead of saying, okay, but this society, like myself, I can say, I spent most of my life fighting racism, but it doesn't mean I did not, and still do today, benefit from white privilege. Because facing that can lead us on a new journey which is painful, and it's like the surgeon's knife. It will hurt, but it's the journey to liberation. And that's the journey that is a lifelong. I mean, you may have been brought up in a home that was anti-racist, people treating people as equal, but the whole society structured on racism. So again, because of your beautiful home, it doesn't let you off the hook. But when I was a young white student, the way we coped with our complicity was to drink bad red wine. And all that did was give us hangovers. And some of us said, stop drinking the bad red wine, join the struggle, join the journey of liberation. And I think the importance of unlearning racism at a school like this is of great importance. It's still a major disease in the world, which is why when Black Lives Matter happened, it resonated across the whole world, including in South Africa, and it's fundamentally important. But I would want to say as well, in my view, the oldest wound of the human family is the relationship between women and men, and the abuse of women by men. Now we know that women can abuse men, but the statistics are very clear. It's like 99% to 1. And that journey is of fundamental importance for the future of the human family. And it involves not just the liberation of women, but the liberation of men. We won't stop gender-based violence unless we bring up the boy child in a new way, unless the boy child learns healthy ways to express their emotions. So those are my 3 answers to your 1 question.
Well, we are at the end, but the microphone is in the hand of one more. So this will be the last question, Will. So we will have Will's question, and then we will call it a night.
And then I'm going to read this poem.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
And he has a closing poem for us. All right, Will.
Hi, my name is Will Odie, and I had the privilege to travel to South Africa with Professor Nave, Professor Matisse, and to see Father Michael. So thank you for coming back here. Thank you for taking the chance with us, again. But I had a question specifically about South Africa and the healing in South Africa. When we were there, there was a clear divide in generation and in the feelings of generations there. The older generation had to deal with the apartheid physically, and they have those physical wounds and traumas. The younger generation is growing up in the land that they are promised to be great. They are promised to have the most progressive constitution in the world. And so their struggle is different. And we saw that while the older generation looks to forgiveness because that is the way they can heal and that's the way they can move on, the younger generation looks to change, and they're angry because they're not being delivered what they've been promised growing up. So I guess my question is, how do you deal with those two different groups differently? How do you talk to those 2 different groups differently?
Yes, no, thank you for that. Part of the work the Institute does is to create spaces for intergenerational conversations. In 1976 was a turning point in South Africa. I'm going back to that to illustrate your point. In 1976, for example, young black people burnt beer halls. They said these beer halls, what we called shebeens, were instruments of oppression. And they said to their parents, you call these white people boss, master, madam, we will not. So this generation went into exile, they became freedom fighters, and then time passed and they became the new government. And then part of our tragedy is we became a democracy at a time in world history where capitalism had gone mad. In the period of the 1980s, the ratio between the poorest paid and the richest increased exponentially across the Western world, as it did in South Africa. So people who had nothing suddenly could earn millions. So greed had its day. And so this generation is now challenging the old and saying, what did you sacrifice for? Well, we don't see it. There are people who say Nelson Mandela was a sellout. Now, Nelson Mandela wasn't a sellout, but I understand what young people are saying. And the South Africa today is not the sacrifice that South Africa today is not the country that we sacrifice for. So corruption is eating us alive. We have we are the most unequal society on earth. We have the highest level of gender-based violence. So we have to reimagine how we proceed as a country. The dreams have not been fulfilled, despite the scale of sacrifice that was made. But you know, being a Christian helps me a little bit, because I'm part of a faith that's been around for a couple of 1,000 years. It gives me a bit of perspective. And in South Africa, there were generations of people who only ever saw things get worse, but they dared to hope. They dared to hope. I think it's a very dark time in human history. The greatest beneficiaries of today's world are the arms manufacturers. Right? Across the Western world, more money is being spent on arms than ever before. Right? The Mother Earth is crying. I believe myself, our children are going to save the world. The Greta Thunbergs of the world are going to save the world. They're going to bring the older generation kicking and screaming to care for Mother Earth. And my prayer is for a new peace movement around the world. And so I want to get permission from God to come back every 100 years and see how we're doing, So there are dark moments in history, and this is a dark moment. You know, my heart is broken every day for what's happening in Gaza. It breaks every day because the United States provides guns in the morning and food in the afternoon. And that's one of the deepest shames of our time. And future generations are going to judge this generation very harshly because we saw genocide happening on our watch and we failed to stop it. And so that's a dark, dark reality. But fortunately, there are voices across the United States. And it's very interesting on your generational point. The younger generation of Jewish Americans support Palestine. The older generation supports Israel. So again, you have this sharp generational divide. So we need to create the spaces where the intergenerational conversations can happen. So we understand where the older generation is coming from, but also they can hear the younger generation. Can I read my poem?
Please, Jerome.
How many of you know John Lennon? John Lennon. Who knows John Lennon? Okay? This morning I woke up very early in the morning and I was saying, what do I say to you guys tonight? And I decided I needed to be John Lennon. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man, I should say, and sisterhood. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. I thank you.
Thank you.